Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, good night, whenever it is that you are watching this video. Welcome to Lesson 4. Today, in this lesson, we're going to be talking about setting, and specifically setting as seen in Stephen King's, believe it or not, short story, Children of the Corn, and William Blake's poem, London. I do apologize for the length of Children of the Corn, but it is not only a very well-told modern story, so it does kind of take us out of the realm of the classics and the romantics, but it does also rely heavily on its setting, so it is a great example of how to use a setting within a story. And William Blake's poem London is an implied setting, which we'll talk about briefly. You didn't want to sleep tonight, did you? Ha 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 ha. Get it? Because Stephen King's Children of the Corn is a scary story. So let's talk a little bit about setting. Setting is the where and the when that your story takes place. It's that simple. It is the time, the place, the social environment, the milieu. A milieu is surroundings, especially of a social or cultural nature. So the culture, this is all part of the setting. Okay, the society in which it takes place, in which your story takes place, or in which your story is written. Okay, so you have an entire subgenre devoted to this idea of social environment and milieu called the dystopian novel, the dystopian society. You have the utopian, which is the perfect world, and then you have dystopia, which is the exact opposite of that. So think your Hunger Games, your Maze Runners, your Divergent, and all those young adult novels that kind of deal with the same topics and the same things and have the same kind of basic story structure. That would be an example of your setting in terms of milieu. When we talk about time, it can be a temporal time, a temporal setting, or a plot time. So 3:30, or in the afternoon, or late one evening. Time can be very restricted. Think if you've ever seen the show 24, each one of those hour-long episodes only lasted an hour in real time. Okay, that's the setting of the story. So it was, and they would tell you at the beginning of each episode, right? They would say the following takes place between 1 a.m. and 2 a.m. And everything that happened in that hour on television was supposedly happening in 1 hour of real time. So it was very restricted. Historical fiction is also an example of a restricted time setting. If I'm telling a historical fiction story that is based around the Civil War, I cannot have the story take place outside the years that the Civil War took place. I cannot have it in 1948 because that's not the Civil War. Okay? Place, geographical or physical setting. So this room, Newton, the Shire, Gotham, galaxy far away, maybe limited to a single area or several different areas. So think there's a film that came out not too long ago called Room, not the Tommy Wiseau movie, but Room, starring Brie Larson, and the first half of that movie takes place entirely within one room. There is no setting change. Stories can be like that as well. Literature setting within a literary sense can be only one place. Okay, a cornfield is one place. You can have common places, unique places, fantastic places, or even impossible places. Place is place. We kind of all understand time and place. Fantasy and magical realism deal with these last two ideas, right, of the fantastic or the impossible. Hogwarts is kind of an example of that. Again, with the Shire, right, or any of the planets in Star Wars, any of those, those star systems. We have what's called a general setting. This would be the years, the region, the country, the world. Nothing specific, just the 1930s, or 1998, or 2020, or the Northern Hemisphere, New England, right, or the United States, right. The general setting often provides historical or cultural context for us. So if we're told that our story takes place in 1993 South Africa, we're looking at the end of, towards the end of apartheid, we're looking at the rise of Nelson Mandela, we're looking at those kind of historical and cultural events. The opposite of general setting then would be particular setting. These are specific, so specific years, specific regions, specific events, and they lie within the general setting. So you can't have particular setting without having a general setting, but you can have a general setting without having a particular setting. We also have vague settings. Vague settings urge us to not focus so much on the setting, but to focus on the other aspects of the story. The conflicts, the human experience, the plot, the symbols, the characters. These would be things like a long time ago. Do we need to know exactly when? No, it was a long time ago. The forest. Do we need to know precisely what forest? Nope. Just a village. Just a cottage. Nothing specific. It can be anywhere. And it's not, even with kind of the general setting, you're given kind of pinpoint. With general setting, with vague setting, it's literally just a long time ago. Star Wars starts out with a vague setting, right? A long time ago in a galaxy far away. That's a vague setting. Or as I like to say, a long time ago, but still somehow in the future. Then we have vivid settings. Vivid settings give your story purpose. This would be setting in a cornfield in Nebraska, in Gatlin, Nebraska. Okay? The King story, The Children of the Corn, is a vivid setting. It gives the story its purpose. Historical fiction, again, vivid settings. We have to know exactly where these stories are taking place in order to provide our perceptions of it and our analysis and interpretation of the story with all the correct data that it needs to process it. Functions of a setting. How does setting function? I mean, it is an integral part of each story. Otherwise, we wouldn't be looking at it. We wouldn't be studying it. Your setting can help to establish your mood, it can help to establish your situation, and it can even help to establish your characters. In Children of the Corn, which you all should have read by this point, that cornfield and the confusion and the disorientation that the characters get from this just from the cornfield itself establishes the mood, the situation, and the characters. Okay, it affects their emotions. It affects our emotions. I've had students after reading this story that say that they have trouble driving past cornfields now because it's, especially at night, because they don't know what's in there. The revealers shape a character. They help to establish aspects of characters' personalities, outlooks, values, things that are necessary to understand the character that you wouldn't get in another setting. They act in the plot. To say that the cornfield, the setting of Gatlin, Nebraska in this story, it doesn't act in the plot, that it doesn't function in the what happened, what will happen, why does it happen of the story, you're not being honest with yourself if you're trying to say that the cornfield doesn't factor into the plot. It prompts characters into action. Bert and Vicky are prompted into doing what they do in this story because of the setting, because of where they are. Okay, they are lost on a highway in a town they've never seen before, that's not on any maps, in the middle of a cornfield. What do they need to do? They need to get out. Right? They need to figure out a way to leave, and how do they do that? By using the setting around them, by trying to figure out their way out of the cornfield. And, the setting can also suggest a key conflict or a theme. You're going to see later on when we get to the loss of innocence chapter of our class, you're going to be reading a story called The Thing in the Forest. Now, that is also a very good example of setting. And in terms of suggesting the key conflict or the theme, the story first takes place in London, then it takes place at a country estate, and where it takes place is important, but it's also when it takes place that's important. It takes place during World War II. Okay, so the beginning part takes place during World War II. The second part, the second half takes place during the Cold War of the 80s, and it was written in 2002, so after 9/11, after we went into the war in Iraq and Afghanistan and into the Middle East. So there is this real life conflict. There are these real life conflicts that are informing the events of the story and the setting of the story. Think World War II London, what's going on? There's bombings. That's why, so the setting itself can be integral in kind of explaining those conflicts and themes. Traditional expectations of time and place. We have associations that will affect how we read certain situations, certain times, certain places, with particular focus on places and times and weather conditions. And okay, so things like even storms, right? We expect storms if we're reading a novel that takes place at sea and there's a storm, that's part of the setting, okay? So what happens after the storm settles? But culture also influences settings, okay? What we see as a traditionally, we might see the forest culturally as you don't go in there, that's evil, that's dark. A culture like Native Americans might view it as, this is where our ancestors are. This is a spiritual place for us to be in these woods. So the setting is going to differ, again, based on culture. That plays to human vulnerability. The fact that no two people or no two groups of people can 100% read the same story and get the same things out of any of the elements within them plays to our human vulnerability and plays to that idea that perceptions are different, right? Based on our experience and our culture and our education. Authors play with these associations in order to reverse them or to question them. Okay, so you think a cornfield wouldn't be that scary, but then you have a cult of murderous children and some kind of deity that we never see. You wouldn't think that a forest in the countryside of England would be that scary, but then you get the events that happen in The Thing in the Forest. Okay. Stories rely on their settings to evoke emotion, both from us as the audience and the characters within. So let's look at Stephen King's biography. Okay. King was born September 21st, 1947 in Portland. He is an American novelist, a short story writer, a screenplay writer, an actor, and a director. This guy does it all, ladies and gentlemen. He does it all. To jump into his home life a little bit when he was younger, again, just like Poe, his father abandoned the family when Stephen was very young. Stephen was 2 years old. This is literally a case of the father went out for cigarettes and never came back. King was much older when he found out that his father only moved 2 streets over from where King ended up living with his mother, and he started a whole new family, and it was essentially out of Stephen's life until Stephen, broke big in the world and became a pop culture icon. Once he started making a ton of money, that's when his father tried to come back into his life. He writes in the realm of horror, supernatural fiction, suspense, sci-fi, fantasy. He's written a few detective novels. He has some nonfiction books. He pretty much has done it all in terms of the types of stories that he writes. He's even written a couple of romance. Not in our traditional sense, but there are love stories in some of his works. These are just, these numbers are out of date every single semester that I do this. Because he's constantly writing. He's one of the few authors that is consistently writing. He writes every day. He's published over 50 novels, 6 nonfiction books, over 200 short stories. That, for the most part, they've all been collected. I'm pretty sure I have all of them on my bookshelf, which my wife does not appreciate. He is the most prolific American author of the 20th century in terms of none of his works have ever gone out of print. Since the 1970s, when he published his first novel, Carrie, none of his novels have gone out of print. They've all been continuously printed. They've gone to different publishers, but none of them have ever ceased publication. None of them have ever stopped being printed. The amount of adaptations of his work that are out there is just phenomenal. There are movies that I'm sure you've seen that you probably didn't even know or didn't even realize were based on Stephen King works. Stand By Me, The Shawshank Redemption. There was a show on Sci-Fi a couple years ago called Haven. That entire TV series was based on a Stephen King novel. Everybody knows about that one, but still, he is the most prolific American author of the 20th century. And we have to say American because J.K. Rowling edges him. It's him and J.K. Rowling for the world, world over. J.K. Rowling is just, she's problematic, but in terms of name recognition and in terms of income based on their works, the two of them kind of fight for supremacy in terms of world known authors in general. But as far as the American authors go, he's number one. I told you the story of his father. That was put in the wrong spot, so I apologize for that. Alright, so an interesting story about him is that he apparently witnessed one of his friends being struck and killed by a train when he was a child. The story went that he and this friend were out playing, and he came back in a completely catatonic state, pale, covered in blood, covered in dirt, sweating, and it was just him, and he wasn't talking to anybody, he wasn't saying anything. He has no memory himself of this, just what he's been told, and he's rarely spoken of it. He makes no mention of it in his memoir On Writing, which came out in 2000. But he has given a couple of interviews where he's mentioned that, this is an event that supposedly happened. If he did, just think of how that would have impacted his writing. Okay, think of how that would have impacted him in such a psychological way that he blocks it out completely. But not only that, how does it impact the rest of him going forward, right? The career that he has, this fascination with death and the dark and good versus evil, and kids are a major focal point of his work. He almost, a great number of his story have to deal with young people being put into these situations that maybe they don't have any right to be in, okay? Or dealing with issues that young kids shouldn't be dealing with. This can all kind of be traced back to these events from his childhood. His father leaving, seeing his friend getting hit by a train. There is a scene in Stand By Me that is very reminiscent of this, where they literally have to run from a train. That happens in the book as well, where they run from a train. And Stand By Me isn't a supernatural novel. It is a coming-of-age story about 4 kids growing up in the 50s, which King grew up in the 50s, okay? His first novel, Carrie, was published in 1974. And since 1974, this should change that 5 to a 6, he has published a novel in each of the last 6 decades. The 70s, the 80s, the 90s, the 2000s, the 2010s, and the 2020s. Okay? He has published books in each of the last 6 decades. In 2 years' time, in 2024, he will have been writing for 60 years. And like I said, he writes every day. He doesn't stop. You can tell I really love Stephen King by how into this presentation that I get. He has well-documented struggles with drugs and alcohol, specifically in the period of like the 80s, the 70s and the 80s. He has gone on record as saying that a lot of his work from that time he doesn't even recall writing. One of his most famous stories is called Cujo. It's about a Saint Bernard that goes rabid and traps a mother and her son in a car for days in the South, and it's hot and it's summertime, so it's they have to deal with dehydration and things like that, and it's just it's a terrifying novel to read, and the film is terrifying as well. But He apparently didn't know he wrote that until they approached him about making a movie based on it. He directed a movie called Maximum Overdrive based off of one of his stories. And to listen to cast interviews, there were just, next to his director's chair, there were just mountains of cocaine. So he struggled heavily with drugs and alcohol addiction. He's since, clean. He's gotten over them, but it was a rough patch for him from the 70s all the way up until about 99. Like I said, he does not remember writing many of his most famous works. In 1999, he was hit by a van and he was almost killed because of this. The driver apparently was turned around to yell at his dog and didn't see King walking down the side of the road, hit him. He broke like almost all of his ribs, his pelvis, his back. He was laid up for a very long time. And that kind of caused a resurgence in his life. It was funny because he had announced his retirement from writing shortly before that happened. And then within 2 months of getting hit by this car, he's publishing a new novel called From a Buick 8, which is about a demon-possessed car. Not to be confused with Christine, which he wrote in the 80s, which was about a demon-possessed car. They're different. They're the same, but they're different. One's a Ford Fury, one's a Buick 8, so they're different cars. But he's continued on, and it's been since 99 that he's written every day, because he says, that put the world into perspective for him, and he he doesn't know when he's gonna not wake up one morning. He created this multifaceted, interconnected universe within his works. A lot of his works take place in the same fictional town. He has Castle Rock, he has Derry, he has another town as well that I can't remember the name of. Characters from certain stories will pop up in other ones. The Dark Tower is a series of 7 novels that he's written. He's written himself as a character in those, and those are kind of the overrunner for all the rest of the stories. So that's where you find the character of Randall Flagg, as well as in The Stand and The Eyes of the Dragon, and he shows up in a bunch of other ones. Pennywise the Dancing Clown shows up in the Dark Tower, but he's also the antagonist in It. The Turtle, this whole interconnected universe, and he did it first. Okay, he did it before Marvel tried it. He did it before DC tried it. He did it before Universal tried and failed after one film. So he was kind of the first person to kind of do this, and on such a global scale that you could fit almost every single one of his works into this universe somewhere. So here's a little video background on him from Watch Mojo.
There can be no doubt that Stephen King, one of the most popular writers of all time, has found literary success and financial security. But things weren't always so comfortable. Welcome to Watch Mojo, and today we'll be discussing the tragic life of Stephen King. King was born in Portland, Maine in 1947 to Nellie Ruth Pillsbury and Donald Edwin Pollock, who went by the surname King.
What you have is a body of work that literally has not been out of print, any of his books, since Carrie, which is a tremendous achievement for any writer.
His troubles began early in life. When he was 2, his father went out for cigarettes and never came back, abandoning the family.
He said, "Ruth, I'm going to go out and get a pack of cigarettes." And that was the last she ever saw of him.
This left Ruth to raise Stephen and his older brother David on her own. Now the sole breadwinner for 2 little boys, she was forced to move often as she searched for stable work, frequently relying on the support of relatives. From Maine, they moved to Wisconsin, Indiana, Massachusetts, and Connecticut. While living in Wisconsin, a 4-year-old Stephen went out to play with another kid, only to return home abruptly, unable to say a word until the following day.
Get the hell off the tracks, Teddy! You want to get yourself killed?
Just like the beach in Normandy.
King claims to have no memory of what transpired, but said that his mother later told him that his friend had been struck and killed by a train. Personal injury would also take its toll. When he was 6, King fell sick. In an incredibly painful and traumatic procedure, his eardrum needed to be punctured multiple times. Shortly afterwards, he had his tonsils removed. As a result of his poor health and multiple hospital visits, King missed a lot of classes, and it was agreed that he should be pulled from school to be re-enrolled and start all over again the next fall. He spent most of the rest of the year in bed or stuck at home. However, there would be an unexpected benefit of this delay in structured education: reading.
Steve was the reader. He's kind of a big, goofy kid.
Without a TV at home, King read everything he could get a hold of, beginning his lifelong passion for the written word. He also discovered that his father had been an aspiring but unsuccessful writer. It wasn't long before King started to write imitations of some of his favorite stories. With his mother's encouragement, he started to write original stories of his own. His mother paid him $0.25 apiece for each of his stories. As he later remarked in his memoir On Writing, these quarters represented his, quote, first buck in the business. Like many working-class families, money was a constant source of distress. His mother worked multiple low-paying jobs. Eventually, when King was aged 11, she moved back to Maine to take care of her aging parents while the rest of the family helped her and her boys. It was not a situation she enjoyed, and one that would motivate King to avoid the same poverty trap.
And now, may the Lord bless you and keep you. May the Lord make his face to shine upon you.
As a teenager, he began writing and submitting stories for publication. He continued to write while a student at the University of Maine.
Stephen began submitting his own stories to magazines, and he started his own collection of rejection slips.
After years of rejection, he sold his first story, The Glass Floor, to Startling Mystery Stories in 1967. At university, he met Tabitha Spruce, a talented writer in her own right. In 1970, they had their first child, daughter Naomi, and married the following year. In 1972, they became a family of 4 with the birth of their first son, Joseph. King earned an education certificate as he continued to work at being a professional writer. But teaching jobs were scarce, and he and Tabitha struggled to earn enough money for the family. Working at an industrial laundry, he despaired that he was fated to repeat his mother's life. Sales of short stories published in men's magazines like Cavalier were often used to bail out last-minute expenses, but barely kept their heads above water. Even after landing a teaching job at the local middle school, King kept working at the laundry in the summers. At this point, the family was living in a double-wide trailer in a small town called Herman.
Cozy. Yes, very cozy for a family.
Life changed dramatically, however, when King was inspired to write a tale about a bullied teenage girl with secret and dangerous powers.
And Carrie, you're dismissed from gym for a week. Just take study hall instead, okay?
He began the story but quickly grew discouraged and threw the pages out. Tabitha, noticing the pages in the trash, recovered them. With her encouragement, King finished Carrie. It was not the first novel he'd ever written, but it would be the first one he managed to get published. It would sell to Doubleday with a $2,500 advance. But the real shocker would come when the paperback rights sold for an incredible $400,000, half of which went to King. A windfall that was almost unimaginable to the young writer. But just as fortune seemed to be turning, tragedy reared its ugly head again. King's mother was diagnosed with uterine cancer in 1973. Chapters of Carrie were read to her aloud from an advanced galley copy, but she would not live to see the book that launched her son's career make it to full publication. The death hit King hard, and he admitted that he was drunk while he gave the eulogy.
You're a whiskey man, are you not?
I was, most of the time.
With the huge success of Carrie, King was determined to keep the good times rolling. He quickly published his second novel, a tale of vampires in small-town America, Salem's Lot. It too was a hit. But it was in 1977, less than 3 years after the publication of Carrie, that he published one of the seminal haunted house stories of the 20th century, and perhaps his best-known work, The Shining. Stephen King had officially become a sensation.
Here's Johnny!
But with his growing success came a growing problem. Having experimented with alcohol from the time he was 18, he knew himself to be susceptible to substance abuse. However, with his new lucrative income, fear of financial ruin, and almost obsessive drive to write, he had access to more invigorating and harmful chemicals. Drugs and alcohol became a part of his everyday life, and in some ways overshadowed it. To this day, he claims he cannot remember writing the story of the killer St. Bernard Cujo because he was so high. When his family staged an intervention, he knew he had a terrible problem and a choice to make.
Man takes a drink, drink takes a drink. And then the drink takes a man.
By the 90s, he was sober and fully established as a horror and cultural powerhouse. But all that was almost taken away on June 19, 1999. While on a walk near his home in Maine, King was struck by a minivan. His injuries were severe and the recovery long. While he had ideas for stories, he had little interest in writing them, as sitting for long periods was a source of great pain.
You mustn't tire yourself. You've got to rest. You almost died.
He briefly considered retiring from writing, but in time he began to heal. He would work his accident into his magnum opus, The Dark Tower, rushing to finish the final 3 novels in the series so his great work would not be left unfinished. Eventually, he got back into the swing of things.
The body's an amazing thing, and little by little, it healed itself. And when that happened, and I started to get some energy back, I wanted to write again.
His pace slowed, but still there seems to be no end to King's creative well. He continues to write and publish steadily. Most people might be content to sit back on their laurels and enjoy a well-earned break. And with an estimated net worth of $400 million, there is a lot to enjoy. With new books and adaptations for film and television coming out regularly, Stephen King has become a household name. Recognized as an important literary figure, he was awarded the World Fantasy Award for Life Achievement in 2004, the Grand Master Award from the Mystery Writers of America in 2007, and in 2014, the National Medal of Arts for his contributions to literature.
For decades, his works of horror, suspense, science fiction, and fantasy have terrified and delighted audiences around the world.
Before we continue, be sure to subscribe to our channel and ring the bell to get notified about our latest videos. You have the option to be notified for occasional videos or all of them. If you're on your phone, make sure you go into your settings and switch on notifications. But despite all his successes, he remains incredibly humble, still calling Maine his home and eschewing the celebrity lifestyle. With all he's earned, he believes in giving back, and he and Tabitha often donate, without fanfare, large sums of money to charitable and local causes. No one can say that Stephen King has not found success, and audiences everywhere, having been given some of the greatest stories and timeless characters of the last 50 years, are all the richer for it.
There are a few guys in baseball fortunate enough to be able to bring it late in their career. Roger Clemens was one, and Nolan Ryan was another one. And I'd like to be that kind of a writer who's still able to bring a fastball.
Check out this other recent clip from Watch Mojo, and be sure to subscribe and ring the bell to be notified about our latest videos.
So these are just some of King's works. These are ones that have been turned into film that are kind of the more popular ones. Carrie, Salem's Lot, The Shining, The Stand, The Dead Zone, Cujo, The Running Man, the Dark Tower series. He wrote, you'll see here, 2 of these say as Richard Bachman. He wrote 6 novels under the name Richard Bachman because he wanted to see if he could write something different and see how well they would sell. It was fairly obvious from the writing style that it was King. But he did maintain that Richard Bachman was a separate person. He even killed off Richard Bachman at one point. But you can actually get the Bachman, they call them the Bachman books, under the name Stephen King. So let's talk about Children of the Corn and its publication history. It was originally published in the March 1977 issue of Penthouse magazine. For those of you that don't know what Penthouse is, it is a sleazier version of Playboy. For those of you that don't know what Playboy is, you're lucky. It was a magazine that featured pictorials of ladies with no clothing on. And Penthouse was a much more explicit type of magazine. But King's early works were published in magazines like those. A lot of authors around that time were published in... I mean, we saw Richard Matheson, right? His story was published in an issue of Playboy. That's where the authors went to get their works published. It was first adapted into a 1983 short film called Disciples of the Crow. It's very difficult to find, but you know, it is out there. You could find it if you looked hard enough. It was adapted into film in 1984. Now, this film spawned 9 sequels and a remake between 92 and 2018. Here's just some of the names of people that have appeared in Children of the Corn sequels. King originally wrote the screenplay for the movie. His version was rejected by the studio because they said it had too much dialogue and backstory, and it was too close to the source material. You can see now why in 1986 King said, if somebody's going to fuck up one of my books, it's going to be me. He was not a fan of the movie. He was already angered by Stanley Kubrick's adaptation of The Shining. Up to that point, he had really only accepted Brian De Palma's Carrie. The Salem's Lot TV miniseries he wasn't really a fan of. So you're getting into kind of... This is why he kind of denounces a lot of adaptations of his work. He loves Frank Darabont, though, so Frank Darabont can do no wrong in his eyes. And you know what? Frank Darabont can do no wrong in my eyes when it comes to adapting King. But yeah, the studio rejected his screenplay because it was too close to the source material, had too much backstory, and too much dialogue. Go figure. Some of the major themes or symbols, and a little bit of the backstory, the historical context here. This is a veiled commentary on the Vietnam War. How veiled is it? Well, it's so veiled that people debate to this day whether or not it is a commentary on the Vietnam War. What it is and how we can look at it kind of as this commentary on Vietnam and the war is the fact that you have children being used essentially as weapons, okay, which happened during Vietnam. You would have unsuspecting American soldiers approached by young Vietnamese children who were strapped with bombs or who had hidden, automatic weapons on them and would open fire, or they would be used as bait to kind of drop the guard of the American soldiers. So you kind of have this same idea with the children of Gatlin. The Supreme Court rules that the death penalty is not inherently cruel or unusual punishment around this time. Stephen King has never been shy when it comes to his political opinions and what side of the fence politically he sits on. He was very much against this ruling. He does think that the death penalty is cruel and unusual punishment. So he would have, added that into his works. There is, a very public execution scene in the story. And again, he's not shy about putting things like that in his work. 3 gunmen abduct a school bus, and the children take the bus back. And then you have Son of Sam serial killer David Berkowitz. For those of you that don't know the story of the Son of Sam, he was a serial killer in New York in the 70s. And he called himself the Son of Sam because he believed that Satan was speaking to him through his neighbor's dog, and the dog's name was Sam. So Satan would speak through the dog to Berkowitz and tell him to go kill all these people. Crazy, crazy, crazy people. So the themes here, we have an unhappy marriage. King writes a lot of marriages like this, which is ironic because his marriage is pretty solid. I mean, him and Tabitha do support each other, and they're both writers. They support each other's dreams and aspirations. I think it ties back to the marriage of his parents and how that dissolved and how that fell apart, and how King's fear was always ending up like his mother, as you heard in that video, and he didn't have a solid foundation in terms of role models to look up to as far as how a marriage should go. So the kind of rocky marriages that he writes about can kind of stem from that. Isolation and desolation. These are isolated people. They're in a desolate town. They're in a desolate situation. There's no hope, okay? You lose hope when you're in a situation like that. Religious fanaticism. King is not against religion. He is against religious fanaticism. That is very important to know. He has one work where it's skewed in a positive light towards organized religion, and that's The Stand. Every other one where he has some kind of religion, they're like the kids in Gatlin. They're this kind of religion. He has a book called Cycle of the Werewolf. It was turned into a film in 1980, I believe 1985, called Silver Bullet. It's about a werewolf, and in that story, in that novella, the werewolf ends up being the local clergyman. So, I mean, it doesn't really get much more on the nose than that. This is a great example. This is a great example of the death of innocence, okay? Because you have... Children are the most innocent creatures. Okay, they have done nothing. They are clean slates. Whatever they know from adults. They learn it from those around them. So to have an entire society of children that murder adults, that murder each other, and that are just terrible people, King is saying, this is the death of innocence right here. The only pure people left aren't even pure. I think at its very heart, he's just telling us that children are evil bastards. And I bring this up because if you Google child murderers, or killer kids, killer children, you get tons of articles like these here. Okay? It's just terrible. They're all over. So moving on to William Blake, again, with our poets, we're just getting a short little biography. As you can see there, 1757 to 1827, he was a British poet, painter, and printmaker. He was known for his poetry and visual arts of the Romantic Age, even though he's kind of slightly before the Romantic Age. Many of his contemporaries considered him mad, but that was mostly due to his idiosyncratic views. He had a very, very unique way of viewing the world and looking at things. He was a key early proponent of both the Romanticism movement and the Nationalism movement. So with Poe, we kind of talked about what Romanticism was. What nationalism is being very much invested in your country, in your nation, and wanting them to succeed in all the ways that they've previously failed. He was a devoted Christian, but he was very hostile towards the Church of England. And it was known, okay? He didn't hide the fact that he was being critical of the Church of England. He apprenticed to an engraver named James Basseer of Great Queen Street. He worked for him for about 7 years. That's where he honed his craft as an That's where he honed his craft as an engraver. His books are all beautifully illustrated. This is page 46 of Songs of Innocence and Experience. This is the plate of London, which is the poem. We're going to listen to it in a minute. It's just beautifully drawn, beautifully engraved. He would have hand engraved all of these, dipped them in ink, and then pressed them onto paper himself. There's several different versions of each plate. Color scheme wise, I mean, they all look, they're all the same plate, but different inks that he would use for different editions of the book. These are gorgeous pieces of art, and that's why I've included this here so that you can see it. And we are going to listen to award-winning actor Idris Elba is going to present this poem to us, and then I'm going to end after that. So So next time, the module, we're going to be looking at theme. We're going to be looking at Flannery O'Connor's short story, A Good Man is Hard to Find, and Jesse Perrin's poem, To the Boys Who May One Day Date My Daughter. Please stick around to listen to the poem being performed by Idris Elba, and remember, as always, to be good people.
I wandered through each chartered street, near where the chartered Thames does flow, and marking every face I meet, marks of weakness, marks of woe. In every cry of every man, in every infant's cry of fear, in every voice, in every band, the mind-forged manacles I hear, how the chimney sweepers cry, every blackening churches appalls, and the hapless soldier's sigh rums in blood down palace walls. But most through midnight streets I hear, how the youthful harlot's curse blasts the newborn infant's tear, and blights with plagues the marriage hearse.